The camera opens on a sunny afternoon, the warm light reflecting off the pristine windows of a bustling, upscale shopping district. The sounds of designer handbags clinking, high heels tapping on the polished sidewalk, and soft chatter fill the air, creating the perfect backdrop of luxury. The camera weaves through the crowd, past well-dressed shoppers carrying shopping bags from the most exclusive brands, eventually focusing on a small, independent boutique nestled between two towering luxury stores. The boutique's glass windows gleam, displaying high-end clothing and accessories that catch the light and the attention of passers-by. The doorbell above the shop chimes as the door opens, and a young boy steps inside. He's about 13 years old, with wide, curious eyes that scan the high-end merchandise surrounding him. His name is Ethan, and though he's dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers, there's a certain determination in his steps. He doesn't belong to the world of luxury he's stepped into, but he's worked hard for this moment. For weeks, Ethan has been saving every penny he earned working part-time at a local diner, scrubbing plates and waiting tables, all with the sole purpose of buying his grandfather a special birthday gift. Ethan is on a mission, and the clock is ticking. He walks carefully through the boutique, avoiding the temptation to touch anything but letting his fingers hover over the sleek fabrics, the soft leather shoes, and the expensive perfumes. He doesn't want to disturb anything. He's here to buy something meaningful, not to waste anyone's time. His heart races in his chest as he walks past the dazzling displays, trying to figure out what to get. Everything feels so foreign to him, the extravagance, the elegance, but he doesn't want to leave empty-handed. Ethan's gaze lands on a pair of shoes displayed on a pedestal. They're shining, polished leather shoes that speak of class, of wealth. He picks them up, running his fingers over them, admiring the craftsmanship. His mind races with possibilities. Would these be the perfect gift for Grandpa? But then, from behind the counter, Margaret, the store owner, watches him closely. Margaret, a middle-aged white woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a sharp, calculating look, stands behind the counter. She eyes Ethan from head to toe, her expression unreadable at first. As she watches Ethan closely, a clear judgment flickers in her eyes. The tension in the air thickens. It's evident. She doesn't expect someone like Ethan to be in her store, let alone touching the merchandise. She's never had someone like him in her boutique before. Ethan can feel her gaze on him, heavy and disapproving. He tries to ignore it, but her silent scrutiny makes him uncomfortable. His fingers tremble slightly as he holds the shoes, his heart pounding faster than it had been moments ago. He places the shoes back on the display, but before he can step away, Margaret speaks up, her voice cold. "You're not going to be able to afford those, son," she says, with an edge of condescension, clearly aiming to humiliate him. Ethan's breath catches in his throat as Margaret's footsteps echo sharply across the boutique floor. The sound is deliberate, calculated. He doesn't have to turn around to know she's coming for him. The sharp click of her high heels gets louder, almost mocking in its precision. When she reaches him, she stands taller, her posture stiff and condescending. She crosses her arms over her chest, her gaze lowering onto him with an icy detachment, as if he's nothing more than an inconvenience. "Can I help you, young man?" she asks, her voice cold, clipped, and professional. Yet there's an unmistakable edge to it, a quiet judgment that makes the words feel like a challenge rather than an offer. Ethan's heart skips. He feels a knot tighten in his stomach, the way he always does when he's caught in the wrong, the way people look at him when he doesn't belong. He straightens up, trying to push his shoulders back, but his voice still shakes as he answers. "I'm just looking around, ma'am." His words come out softer than he intended, as if they don't belong in a store like this. Margaret's face hardens, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing into a thin line. She takes in his worn-out sneakers, his faded t-shirt. The look in her eyes is as dismissive as her tone when she speaks again. I don't think you'll find anything in here that fits you. The words hit harder than he expected. He feels a flush of heat crawl up his neck, a mixture of shame and anger bubbling inside him. Her judgment stings, but he doesn't back down. For a moment, neither of them speaks. Margaret stands tall, towering over him with the weight of her authority. Ethan looks down at the shoes he had been holding, the polished leather glinting under the store lights, now a reminder of the world that's so far out of his reach. He places the shoes gently back onto the display, his fingers lingering on the smooth surface for just a second longer than necessary. He doesn't want to make any more noise, doesn't want to draw any more attention. But he knows he can't stay. With a quiet breath, he turns and starts walking toward the door. His footsteps feel heavy, each one dragging him closer to the reality of being rejected, unwanted. But Margaret doesn't let him go that easily. Her voice rises, sharp and unyielding. You shouldn't even be in stores like this. We don't cater to your type. The words freeze him in place. His stomach twists. He stops in his tracks, his chest tight as if he's been hit by a punch. The weight of her judgment bears down on him, the sting of her words cutting deeper than any physical blow ever could. He feels small, invisible in the way people like her expect him to be. I didn't mean any harm, Ethan says quietly, the words barely above a whisper. He tries to steady his voice, but it cracks. I'm just trying to look around. Margaret's glare is icy now, as if she's waiting for him to be crushed under the weight of her contempt. I said leave, she snaps, pointing firmly toward the door. The force in her voice is undeniable, and for a moment, Ethan considers leaving, turning around, walking out as she commands. But a fire rises in his chest, and he can't swallow the humiliation any longer. He faces the door, but not before stealing one last look at the woman who's made him feel like an intruder in a world he's never been allowed into. She doesn't care. Her gaze is already back to the counter, dismissing him completely. Ethan's heart races as he steps forward, his feet dragging with the weight of everything he's feeling. Humiliation, anger, confusion. The door chimes softly as he walks out into the street, but it feels like a slap in his face, the sound sharp and final. He doesn't dare look back. His chest tightens with every step he takes, but he keeps walking, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as if he could hide the ache there. The sting of her words, the look of dismissal, the weight of everything he wasn't allowed to be. Outside, the world continues on, indifferent. The hustle and bustle of the shopping district goes on, people with their designer bags, their luxury cars, their perfectly curated lives. And here he is, Ethan, just another kid who doesn't belong. The tears threaten to come, but he swallows them down. He can't let anyone see. He won't let them see. He turns the corner and walks into the rain, his steps slower now, the ache in his chest gnawing at him. And as he walks, he can't help but wonder how many other people, kids like him who don't have the money, who don't have the right skin color, who don't belong in the world Margaret occupies, are made to feel the same way. It's not just a store, it's the world. And the door she closed behind him wasn't just made of glass. It was built of the rules and biases that keep people like him out. Ethan's feet dragged as he walked down the sidewalk, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily on his shoulders. The words Margaret had said to him, the humiliation, the sting of being told he didn't belong, everything felt like a heavy burden he couldn't shake off. He pulled out his phone, hoping to distract himself. The screen lit up as he dialed his grandfather's number, his fingers nervously tapping against the phone case. He needed to hear his grandfather's voice. He needed some comfort, some sense of reassurance. After everything, Ethan needed to feel like someone cared. The call rang a few times before the familiar, warm voice of Charles Whitaker, his grandfather, answered. Hey, Ethan, how's your day going? Ethan swallowed hard, trying to force the words out. His chest tightened as he spoke, trying to keep his voice steady. I I went to the store, but they kicked me out." His voice wavered, and he felt the anger build again. "She said I didn't belong there." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and Ethan could hear his grandfather's breath, steady and calm. Then Charles's voice grew firmer, a sharpness creeping into his tone. "What store was that, Ethan?" Ethan quickly mentioned the boutique, not thinking much of it. It wasn't just about the store. It was about how he'd been treated, how he'd been looked down on, made to feel less than. There was no mistaking it now. Charles's reaction was immediate, his tone unyielding. "Wait right there, Ethan, don't move. I'll be there in a few minutes." Ethan blinked in confusion. He had no idea what his grandfather planned to do, but something in Charles's tone told him this wasn't over. This wasn't just about a shopping experience. "Okay," Ethan mumbled, stepping to the side of the street, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of his grandfather. He hadn't expected any response like this. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. What could Charles possibly do about this? Minutes passed, and just as Ethan started to feel lost in his own thoughts, a sleek black limousine turned the corner and pulled up in front of the boutique. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. His heart skipped a beat as the limo came to a stop in front of the store, the door swinging open with a smooth, practiced motion. A tall, older man stepped out, gray hair neatly combed, a polished suit that screamed power, and an air of undeniable authority. Ethan's jaw dropped as the realization hit him. It was his grandfather, Charles Whitaker, the man who had spent years building his empire, the billionaire entrepreneur who had made a name for himself in the business world. Ethan knew he came from wealth, but he had no idea just how much his grandfather's influence stretched. As the limo driver opened the door for Charles, Ethan stood frozen, staring in disbelief. There was no way he could have imagined this. His grandfather, who had always been there with words of encouragement, who had raised him when his parents weren't around, had just arrived in a limousine to handle something as simple as a boutique owner's unkind words. Charles stepped onto the sidewalk with confidence, his gaze unwavering. He didn't look around at the surprised onlookers. He didn't acknowledge the murmurs or the wide-eyed stares. His eyes were fixed ahead, focused on the boutique like it was a target to be taken down. Ethan stood there, his mind racing. What was going on? Why had his grandfather come here, to this little store on a quiet street? What could possibly happen next? Charles didn't pause. His steps were deliberate, powerful, each one echoing with the weight of authority that followed him. Ethan watched as his grandfather walked toward the boutique without hesitation, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He had always known his grandfather was someone important, but seeing him now in person, with such presence, it was as if the entire world had suddenly taken notice. Ethan blinked, still trying to process the reality of the situation. Inside the boutique, Margaret was standing behind the counter, her face a mask of polite professionalism as she wiped down the counter. She didn't notice Charles approaching until he was almost at the door. Her expression shifted as she saw the tall, imposing figure approaching, but she didn't have time to react before Charles stepped into the store. The doorbell chimed softly, and Margaret looked up just in time to meet the gaze of the man who had just entered. For a split second, her smile faltered. Charles's voice cut through the air, smooth but commanding. "I believe you had an encounter with my grandson Ethan earlier today." Margaret blinked, clearly caught off guard. She straightened, her eyes scanning Charles's sharp suit, his confident stance. Her lips parted, and for a moment no words came out. Charles didn't wait for her to find her voice. "You don't know me, but I'm Charles Whitaker, and I suggest you treat my family with the respect they deserve." His voice didn't rise, but every syllable carried the weight of a man who wasn't accustomed to being ignored or dismissed. Margaret's face paled slightly, and her eyes darted toward the door, likely searching for the strength to defend herself. But in front of Charles, she was like a child caught in a lie. I don't appreciate people being judged based on their appearance or assumed worth, Charles continued, his eyes narrowing. Ethan is my family, and no one gets to treat him like that. Ethan stood outside, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the exchange. He had never seen his grandfather like this before, not this fierce, not this commanding. It was as if Charles was a different person entirely when it came to defending his family. Inside, Margaret stammered, struggling to form an apology. I didn't mean... Charles's gaze didn't soften. You should be ashamed of yourself. His words were calm, but they were edged with an intensity that left no room for argument. But don't worry. I'll make sure your store doesn't have to deal with someone like my grandson again. Before Margaret could respond, Charles turned and made his way back toward the door. The store's atmosphere completely shifted. The power he carried wasn't in his wealth. It was in his unwavering confidence and his loyalty to his family. As he reached the door, he glanced back at Ethan, who had been standing just outside the store, still processing everything. Charles's eyes softened as he met Ethan's gaze. Let's go, kid. I've got something to show you. Ethan blinked, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. He couldn't believe it. His grandfather had just walked in, shut down a situation, and now, it was as if the world had turned in his favor. As Charles stepped through the boutique's glass door, a subtle but unmistakable shift occurred in the room. Margaret's eyes widened as she took in his appearance, his tall frame, his tailored suit, and the undeniable aura of authority that followed him. For a brief moment, her face faltered, her mask of calm professionalism slipping. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had no idea who this man was, but the way he carried himself made her feel as if she were suddenly standing in the presence of someone far more powerful than herself. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, standing just outside the store, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, still trying to process what had just happened. Charles's gaze swept across the room, scanning the space as if taking in every detail. His eyes finally landed on Margaret, and his voice rang out, smooth and commanding. Good afternoon, he said, his tone calm but unmistakably authoritative. Margaret quickly composed herself, pulling her lips into a tight, controlled smile. Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you? Her voice was slightly shaky, and she took a step toward him, trying to maintain some semblance of control. Charles didn't wait for her to say anything more. Instead, he simply continued. I'm Charles Whitaker, he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the boutique. I believe my grandson was just here. Margaret froze, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second as the name struck her like a lightning bolt. She knew the name, Charles Whitaker, the billionaire businessman, the owner of multiple high-end properties across the city. His presence alone was enough to shake the ground beneath her feet. But she didn't let it show. She couldn't. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, with forced composure, she nodded. Yes, I remember. Ethan, right? The silence in the room grew heavier. Charles didn't need her response. He already knew exactly what had happened. I was just informed that my grandson was treated poorly in your store, Charles continued, his voice steady, but a sharp edge beneath it made the words cut through the space between them like a blade. In fact, you kicked him out simply because of who he is, didn't you? Margaret's breath caught in her throat, her face suddenly flushed with discomfort. She opened her mouth to offer an excuse, but Charles didn't give her the chance. I'm not interested in your excuses, he said flatly, stepping closer to the counter. His presence filled the room, making everything around him feel smaller. Margaret could feel the weight of his gaze like a heavy hand on her chest, suffocating her. I don't take kindly to people treating my family like that, he continued, his voice firm, resolute, especially when they've done nothing wrong. The words hung in the air like a warning, a promise that Charles wasn't a man to be crossed. The other customers in the store had fallen silent, now watching the confrontation unfold with growing interest, their eyes shifting between Charles and Margaret. The atmosphere in the boutique had changed from luxury and exclusivity to something tense, electric, as if every word was a piece of the puzzle that would unravel this entire charade. Charles took a long, steady breath, his eyes scanning the room before he continued. "You see, I own half of the buildings on this street, including this one," he said, his words deliberate and powerful. He glanced briefly out the window, making sure everyone knew he wasn't speaking lightly. The room grew quieter. The murmurs from the customers ceased as they absorbed the weight of his declaration. Margaret's face went pale, her hand gripping the counter more tightly, as if holding on for dear life. Charles's eyes locked onto hers, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm here to tell you that I've just decided to purchase this store." His voice softened slightly, but the force of his words had already landed. Margaret opened her mouth to say something, to argue, but Charles raised his hand, cutting her off without even a flicker of hesitation. "And," he said, his tone now final and cold, "you're fired." The words hit Margaret like a ton of bricks. Her face drained of color, and for a split second, she looked as though she couldn't believe what she had just heard. She stumbled back a step, trying to collect herself, her hands shaking as she searched for something, anything, to say. But nothing came out. The world seemed to stop for a moment as she stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Charles didn't wait for her to find her words. He turned on his heel, already making his way toward the door. The entire room felt suffocating under the weight of what had just occurred. Margaret stood rooted to the spot, her mouth agape, unable to form a coherent response. Behind him, the doorbell chimed as Charles stepped back outside, his posture unyielding. The room, once filled with the clink of expensive shopping bags and the hum of casual conversation, was now silent, deadened under the weight of his words. As Charles reached the door, he glanced back at Margaret one last time. His eyes were steady, unwavering, and his voice was calm. "I'll be in touch to arrange the transition," he said, as if this were just another transaction, another part of his day. And with that, he stepped out of the store, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The silence in the boutique felt deafening. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the customers who had been witnesses to this shocking exchange were left stunned, unsure of how to react. Margaret stood motionless, her face pale, her hands gripping the counter as if trying to steady herself. Her mind raced as she tried to grasp what had just unfolded. The humiliation, the shock, the reality that she had just been fired by the billionaire whose property she stood in, all because of her actions toward a young boy who didn't deserve any of it. Outside, Charles had already made his way to the limousine, the driver holding the door open for him. Ethan stood just beyond the store, watching in disbelief as his grandfather walked away from the boutique, his posture strong, his face calm. For the first time, Ethan could feel the shift. The world felt like it was suddenly moving in his favor, and he wasn't just a kid from the wrong side of town anymore. Charles stepped outside, the cool air surrounding him like a shield. The world felt quiet now, the chaos of the boutique left behind, the air thick with unspoken words. His limousine was waiting just a few feet away, the black, sleek vehicle glimmering under the afternoon sun. But as his eyes found Ethan standing just outside, the sight of his grandson hit him like a wave of pride. Ethan was still standing there, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his expression a mixture of confusion and awe. The boy's gaze was fixed on the ground, as though he were still processing everything that had just unfolded in the store. The shock was written all over his face. His body trembled slightly, and for a moment Charles wondered if Ethan was in shock, or if the weight of what had happened was just too much to bear. Charles approached him slowly, his steps deliberate but gentle. The moment their eyes met, he smiled warmly, trying to convey the reassurance and strength that his grandson so desperately needed in that moment. "You all right, kid?" Charles asked, his voice soft but filled with warmth. Ethan nodded, but Charles saw the faint tremble in his shoulders. And then it happened. The tears began to well up in Ethan's eyes, his face contorting as he tried to hold them back. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, but the emotion was too much. He couldn't hold it in any longer. "Grandpa?" Ethan's voice cracked, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "I didn't mean for all this to happen." His hands shook as he clasped them together, as if trying to steady himself, trying to force the situation back into control. But it was no use. Charles's heart tightened as he watched his grandson struggle. He had seen Ethan grow up, had seen the quiet strength in him even in the most difficult moments. But he knew this was different. This wasn't about surviving. This was about something much deeper, something that had broken Ethan in a way that words alone couldn't heal. Charles didn't say anything at first. Instead, he stepped closer to Ethan, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his grandson's shoulder. The action was simple, but it was all Ethan needed to feel the connection. It was like the world had momentarily paused, giving them this quiet moment of understanding. "You didn't do anything wrong, son," Charles said, his voice steady and sure. He could feel the weight of the situation, but he wouldn't let Ethan carry it alone. People like her need to be reminded that no one is better than anyone else. You deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who you are or where you come from. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he tried to hold back the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm him. But there was no stopping it. The tears came, spilling down his cheeks, and for a moment, Ethan let himself collapse into the vulnerability that had been building up for so long. The hurt, the anger, the confusion. It was all too much to keep buried. Charles didn't say anything more. He just stood there, a solid presence beside his grandson, letting him feel the support he so desperately needed. The weight of the world seemed to lift from Ethan's shoulders with each passing second. He didn't have to explain himself. He didn't have to apologize for wanting something better. "I'm proud of you, kid," Charles whispered, his voice low and comforting. "You didn't back down, and that's what matters." Ethan finally managed to catch his breath, his sobs subsiding into quiet sniffles. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to regain composure, but the overwhelming sense of relief that washed over him was too strong to ignore. The world around him seemed to shift, like a cloud had parted, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. "Thank you, Grandpa," Ethan whispered, his voice still raw but filled with gratitude. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had just experienced. The words he had never been able to say before, the words that felt like they would release the tension that had been building for so long. Charles smiled, his grip tightening slightly on Ethan's shoulder, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He looked at his grandson with a quiet reverence, as though seeing him for the first time in a new light. It wasn't just about the money, the property, or the status. It was about the values they carried, the strength, the integrity, the love for family. And in that moment, Charles knew that Ethan had everything he needed to succeed. The world might have tried to knock him down, but he was stronger than that. He was smarter than that. "Come on," Charles said, breaking the silence with a gentle tone. "Let's get you something better than that boutique could ever offer." He gestured toward the waiting limousine, his eyes sparkling with a mix of humor and affection. "I think you deserve it." Ethan's lips curved into a small, tentative smile, the weight of the world still heavy in his chest, but not nearly as much as before. He nodded and took a deep breath, ready to move forward, ready to face whatever came next. As they made their way to the limousine, Charles's presence beside him felt like a shield. The car door opened, and Charles gestured for Ethan to get in first. As they sat down inside, the world outside felt suddenly lighter, less oppressive. Ethan looked out the window, feeling a quiet sense of hope building inside him. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer invisible. And with his grandfather by his side, he knew that no matter what came next, he wouldn't have to face it alone. Charles smiled at him from across the seat, his eyes filled with a kind of quiet wisdom. "This is just the beginning, Ethan," he said, his voice soft but confident. "You've got a future ahead of you, one that no one can take away." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion. His grandfather had always been there for him, but now it felt like he was giving him something even more important, a sense of worth, a sense that he, too, belonged in a world where people like Margaret had tried to shut him out. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he could finally breathe again. As the sleek black limousine rolls down the road, Charles and Ethan sit in the plush interior, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between them. The camera lingers on their faces, capturing the quiet understanding that has passed between them. The weight of the confrontation, the chaos of the boutique, and the emotions of the past few hours seem to fade, leaving a sense of peace in their wake. Ethan looks out the window, the world rushing by, but his mind is clearer than it has been all day. The sting of what happened at the boutique is still there, but it's no longer as sharp. His grandfather's actions have given him a strength he didn't know he had. And even though the world might be unfair, even though people like Margaret would try to keep him out of spaces he deserved to be in, Ethan knows one thing now. He has someone who will always stand up for him, no matter what. Charles sits across from him, his presence a steady reassurance, the kind that only comes from years of experience and hard-earned wisdom. He doesn't need to say anything more. Ethan can feel the weight of his grandfather's love, his protection, and the unspoken bond that ties them together. The world may throw obstacles in his way, but with Charles by his side, Ethan feels ready to face whatever comes next. The camera pans back to the boutique. The once bustling storefront now stands empty, its windows dark, the closed sign swinging lightly in the breeze. The silence that fills the space is profound, like a chapter has ended with no more words to say. Charles's legacy of fairness and respect has already made its powerful statement. The message is clear. Injustice, no matter how small or insidious, will never go unnoticed. Inside that store, Margaret's actions were called out, and in that moment, she was shown the consequences of her disdain. But outside, in the quiet, Ethan walks away from the experience stronger than he could have imagined. He walks away empowered, knowing that no matter where he comes from, no matter the obstacles, his worth is undeniable. The video closes with a final shot of Ethan's face, his eyes now filled with something new: pride. Pride in himself, pride in his family, and a quiet confidence that nothing in the world can diminish his sense of value. He smiles, his face lighting up with a newfound understanding. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment to change everything,